Hey. Tired? Wait, why are you tired? It's Cooper, right?
Yeah.
Why are you tired? Was it because of this class? Yeah, I didn't guess so. All right. Well, that's good. Today we're going to talk about the ideology of the Edo period. The Edo period, I was walking with Mr. Higgins on the way to class today, and he was reading a text we're going to look at on Friday. He was remarking at the control, the ideological control that the government is trying to instill in the population. So I want to understand that today and give you what you need to think about this for Friday. So for Friday, before I forget, do the readings. It's only about 2 pages. It's a primary source, and then in class, you'll have a worksheet that you'll do in class based on those 2 pages of reading about how to evaluate and understand a primary source. So that's what that is going to be about. And also, tomorrow I will post the reading questions for Shibagoro, which is your next reading assignment, your next major reading. It's a book. It's an autobiography or sort of a memoir of a samurai whose family was on the losing side of the Meiji Restoration. So you'll get to see sort of what it looks like to experience the positive change of restoration when you're not on the right side of that change, initially at least. So those will be up on Moodle tomorrow. So just to kind of take us a few steps back, I want to recall, right, last class we discussed Japan's unification across these new roads, the 5 major roads, the Gokaido. The most important of these roads. Which one is the most important of these roads? So you can all just say it. It's okay. Tokaido, right? This one here, the Eastern Sea Road is the most traveled. It's the best equipped. But all of these roads do lead to the capital. We also discussed Edo, how it goes from being a small marshy fishing village to becoming a castle town to becoming the capital of the shogunate, and all that goes into that. Population increases by a factor of 10 within the first 60 or 70 years. And we talked about also the capital as a planned city, right, with different classes living in different places, with motivations and incentives to try and draw people of the artisan classes, the craftsman class, into these given neighborhoods. We discussed also the upper and lower city and that division. The Yamanote, the upper city, and Shitamachi of the lower city, being that division. So that was last class. If you weren't here or if you forgot, there's a reminder. So we talked about how the Edo, the government in Edo, right, the Tokugawa shogunate, really shaped Japan and its history from then forward by making this capital, by making these roads safe and well, sort of well taken care of, etc. We also discussed these settlements. We talked about the Sankin Kotai. Do you guys recall what that Japanese term refers to? It's one of the settlements we talked about last class. It involves the daimyo. Huh? Alternate attendance. And tell me your name? Kendall. Yes, Kendall. So this is alternate attendance. We discussed that and how it was a big expense. This keeps the samurai class, it keeps the daimyo a little bit poor. They have to have a house in the capital and a house back home. They have to leave their families in the capital, so there's always a hostage possibility if they were to rebel. And it's very showy and extravagant, right? So all this draws resources away from possibly rebellious daimyo, and it also feeds the capital and makes it a very wealthy and bustling city. We also discussed another one of these settlements, which is the no ships, Christians, or foreigners outside of Nagasaki, very briefly at the end of class, and I want to pick up there today as we continue. So again, Nagasaki down here, sort of at the edge of Japan, in Kyushu. This is the place where foreigners are going to be allowed to live. We discussed how Christianity came to Japan very briefly, the Portuguese shipwrecking, and then in their wake come the Jesuits who propagate Christianity and have some success for about 50 years. But eventually the knowledge that the Portuguese are part of a larger empire, right, and that this empire could very well be coming to take over Japan, among other things. One Jesuit, for example, he offers Hideyoshi he proposes to go and ask a merchant ship captain if they can use his boat to help Hideyoshi invade Korea. So, a missionary doing that, for example, it set off some sort of red flags for Hideyoshi. Christianity it quickly becomes not once but twice prohibited in Japan. Hideyoshi first makes a prohibition in 1587, and then again when Tokugawa Ieyasu is in power, his son then again proclaims Christianity illegal. So this second process of making it illegal is enforced. It's much more thorough. Foreign priests have to leave, and this includes Franciscans, who've also come out after a while, and Dominicans who also come in the meantime, as well as Jesuits. Christian daimyo, of which there were a handful, and they were relatively powerful, they have to recant, or some of them actually lost their positions. So it became, again, kind of a bit of a witch hunt, right, to find who was a Christian, to weed them out, and to force them to admit that this was actually not a true religion. People across Japan were also asked to stop being Christians, and to verify this, the government required them to demonstrate that they were not Christians by stamping on a picture of Jesus or Mary. This is called fumie, or image stomping. It was actually quite brutal. People were sometimes tortured to force them to recant. There was a movie that came out a few years ago by Martin Scorsese called Silence, based on a book by a well-known Japanese Christian author about this period in time. So if you want more on that, you can go watch the movie. It's very slow, but I think it's also very accurate. People sometimes were skinned alive. People were hung upside down into feces, and their ankles were cut so they could still breathe. Their body could breathe while they were under the feces. So it was, again, a very hard time. Christianity becomes severely illegal in this time period. There is a holdout Christian group, Christian daimyo, in a place called Shimabara, which is also down close to Nagasaki, not very far from Nagasaki at all, the center of Christianity in Japan at this point in time. They refuse to recant. They refuse to stop being Christians, and they hole up in the castle, in Shimabara Castle, and they resist the government. The government has to actually send troops. There's a siege. About 10,000 people fight. Eventually the siege is broken, and they are mostly massacred. So again, Christianity was a threat perhaps ideologically, but it actually also becomes a threat with arms and actual violence. So no more Christianity in Japan. This event essentially is the last stand of Christianity in Japan. There are no more Christians openly professing to be Christians in Japan for a little more than 2 centuries. The one exception to this whole rule, foreigners and Christians, is a place called Dejima. The shogun is very aware that the money being brought in from this trade that the Portuguese were carrying between Nagasaki and China, the Chinese silk, Japanese silver trade, is very lucrative. They doesn't want to lose that trade. And while the Portuguese and the Spanish are increasingly looking suspicious, the Dutch arrive. They've taken over several British holdings, and they are making their way from Batavia up to Japan. They arrive, and they say, we could also do this trade. We have merchant ships, we have gunboats, and we don't actually go around trying to convert people to Christianity. We don't try and evangelize. So how about if we step into the shoes of the Portuguese and we keep the trade going and promise not to evangelize? And the shogun is okay with this. So Dejima is a little sort of man-made port built to allow these Dutch merchants to come and trade once a year. They come and they get the Japanese orders for silk and the Japanese money, and they take it over to China, where they get the silk and they bring it back. So this is the only place in Japan where foreigners are allowed to live for almost 2 centuries. And it's pretty small, right? You can count the number of houses and the so-called factories or the bases that are here. It's very small. And this is Japan's window on the West. It's very small, but it's also, despite that, it's also very impactful. This window really brings in a lot of information to Japan about the West. The most important person for this cultural sort of importation is the Dutch doctor. Usually they're actually German doctors hired by Dutch ships to come and live year-round at this Dutch factory or this Dutch port. And they live there, and they're kind of bored. So they actually spend time reading Japanese. Eventually, Japanese go and seek them out to try and learn more about Western science and technology. They bring maps of the West. They bring books, lots and lots of books about Western medicine, which the Japanese are eager to understand. This actually leads to a rush to try and get information about Western medicine. This is one of the areas where the Japanese really are very impressed. They're also impressed by astronomy, and the government recognizes the importance of all this. They begin to bring up this Dutch doctor, who changed every 10 or 20 years, to the capital to show him, the capital, but also to ask him for new information. So, very small window, but the information about the West is getting into Japan through this small window and making its way up to Edo. The observatory that's created in 1744 is the result of a collaboration between the shogunate's astronomers and this Dutch physician. The Japanese who are going to this to learn, sort of being tutored by these Dutch physicians, they begin to also translate books from Japanese to Dutch. So they actually learn Dutch. So before there was English in Japan, there was Dutch. This was the language to learn, to understand science. The term Rangaku refers to the red-headed Dutch people who were the source of all this knowledge. And it becomes quite a vibrant little subfield in Japan. And the government actually overturns an edict banning Western books in 1720 to, again, keep this window open and alive. Can you see what's happening in this image? It's probably hard to see. Sorry for the strange animation, but you see what's happening here? It's an autopsy, right? So thinking about Shinto, right, and about the separation of the dead and the impure from the pure, you would never take a dead body and look at what's inside. Like, are you kidding me? Right? And here the Dutch, and before them the Germans, have been doing this for some time, right? And they have books about it. The Japanese, they take these books. These books become sources of their knowledge about the human anatomy. There are only a few recorded autopsies happening in Japan, even still at this point in time, but these books are really helpful. So this helps Japan to really progress in terms of medicine. Yeah. Is your hand up, Antonio? Okay, just a little stretching. Yeah, Ben? So at this point in time, hiragana exists, but writing is all done in kanbun, which is a Chinese character. There's not much hiragana. Hiragana is used for books for women and for children and for the lower class, and I'll actually discuss that. That's a good question. But these books are written in complicated Chinese that only people who are highly educated can read. So the samurai class and some very wealthy merchants. And can you see what this is here? This is a drawing of something. Microscope. Yeah, this is a microscope, right? The Dutch, as we know, are pioneers in microscope invention. This is one of the things that the Japanese are also excited about. But we're still worried about Christianity and about what it can possibly do to Japan, even though there are actually no Christians left in Japan at this point in time. Christians that are in Japan have gone into hiding, but just to be sure, and part of the system that brings people in front of the fumie, or the stomping, the image stomping process, is the temple registration system. This system, the shumon, it's called shumon in Japanese, shumon atame. It refers to a system of registration where at birth and at marriage and at death, people have to register these major events at their local Buddhist temple. So this is a really big deal. Buddhism has been prospering. It has lots of temples all over Japan. There are big monasteries, as we may have discussed, maybe not in this class, but it's a very strong religion in that sense. But it has no ties to the state. Right? The state is sort of a bit separate from Buddhism. They've even worked under Oda Nobunaga and Hideyoshi to weaken Buddhism. So all of a sudden, we've made Buddhist temples the holders of the information on Japan's population. So it's a really big shift. They also get money for this, right? So this adds to their wealth and their power in Japan as well. This was supposed to be a measure aimed at making sure that there were no Christians left in Japan. And I mean, people had to, even up to around 1700, stomp on the image of Jesus or Mary. So this does still have that form. And there are signs all over Japan, big wooden placards that say Christianity is illegal until 1873. So this is very much still part of the background of this system. But there are no Christians in Japan left. They were executed. They've been exiled. There's no one trying in Japan to secretly preach Christianity. They're afraid of it. So there's no real threat to Christianity. So if I tell you that, what other reason might the government have for maintaining this practice? Why would they keep this system in place? It's a lot of work, right? Having to go to this place to register, having to maintain these ties. The government has to pay the temples to keep up the records. So why are they doing this? Yeah. And this is an open question, so anyone who's listening can just raise your hand and contribute. I see a couple of hands I know well, so I will call on you if I don't have any other new hands. Was it Lauren? Yeah. Yeah, right? I mean, this is a great way to have a census. So that's one very good reason. And I put that on my PowerPoint slide somewhere. Yes. All right. What else? Another reason. And tell me your name. David? Okay. Okay, so this is a very interesting point. So creating sort of an identity. One of the things I hadn't talked about, because this is a very short section on Edo Japan, is about the way that religion is coming back into the picture, right? They're talking about Japan as the land of the gods. The edict that Hideyoshi writes to ban Christianity the first time, it talks about Christianity as the sort of antithesis of the opposite, right, of Japan, because it's not the way of the gods, right, and it goes against Japan's identity as a country of the gods, right, which refers to Shinto, right. So there is this nascent movement to promulgate and propagate Shinto as the religion of Japan, and this creates cultural, as you said, right, cultural unity, right, and this is definitely an important part of this effort. So in this case, it's Buddhism, because they have more infrastructure in place. And Buddhism actually, as we may or may not have a chance to talk about in this class, and Shinto are actually living more or less side by side. They're cross-pollinating each other at this point in time. So Buddhism is not being treated as a foreign, but as a Japanese religion at this point in time. So there is cultural unity that can be achieved by having this connection to temples. A very good point. A third reason, and this is probably not necessarily evident, has to do with ideology, right? So how does the government, who's far away in Edo, tell the person living in the boondocks in Kyushu what is good, what's not good, what to do, what not to do? How do you get the information from the top to the bottom, right? Cash? Yeah, definitely. So temples, they are the learned people of Japan, right? These are the learned people, the monks and priests spend lots of time reading. They speak Chinese, read Chinese. They are the knowledge repositories for Japan. So if they give you information, it's probably pretty good, right? Go to them for advice as well as spiritual guidance. This is part of how ideology is diffused in the Edo period, right? The temples pass on edicts, right? They put up on their placards, on their boards, the new laws that are passed, and there are lots of laws passed in the Edo period. And they also put up things that indicate the right kinds of ideology to be practicing, ways to think better. So all these measures are part of an ideological diffusion that's happening through temples, through the system. The ideology that's being propagated is Confucianism, and it's actually a brand that I'll talk about in a second. As we talked about a few classes ago, right, this Chinese Confucianism comes to Japan and becomes very influential, but the bases are not very different from the original Chinese Confucianism. So Confucius lived in the 500s, was a scholar writing about how to make society function better, right? This is a series of political, ideological, truisms that he's writing down. His, I think, student Mencius continues the process, and together they've written the 4 books and the 5 classics, which are the basis for government theory, if you will, like political theory and political economy in China before the Common Era. These come to Japan and they're influential in ancient Japan in the 600s, 700s, 800s, and they're very influential in that way. But a new form that is more recent during the Song Dynasty, developed by Jushi, comes back to Japan in the Edo period. So Jushi essentially wants to get back to the original Confucian writings. There's been so much glossing, interpreting, writing, right, based on what the original text had to say, that he thinks that we've lost track of the original ideas of Confucius. We need to get back to that. We need to simplify, right, and we need to make it easier for people to adhere to the basics of Confucian thought. One of the important things he would like to emphasize is sort of what the natural order of things. The reason that there's upheaval in China right now is because we've gotten away from this core idea of things having a natural place in society, etc. He's very big on the 5 relationships. So, father to child, husband to wife, ruler to subject. These 2 in particular, there's an order here, right? There's a higher and a lower. So the higher owes something to the lower owes something in exchange to the higher. Usually the higher owes benevolence to the lower, not being a jerk, right, being fair. And those who are below, they owe obedience and loyalty to the ones above. Other 2, sibling, and friend, are a bit more egalitarian, if you will. But these are a key part of Jushi's ideology, Neo-Confucian ideology, and in Japan, this is the ideology that's going to be propagated by the shogunate and taught at Buddhist temples and sort of embodied in Buddhist in government edicts, pasted or posted in Buddhist temples, as well as throughout Japan in other ways. At the very top, the shogunate has embraced this ideology from the very beginning. Right, the first 3 shoguns have they employ a scholar named Hayashi Razan, who is a Confucian scholar, a Neo-Confucian scholar. Hayashi Razan is I think he's probably the top advisor. There are several, but I think you would say he's the top, in part because he is the one who gets to be in charge of his own academy, the Hayashi Academy. It's also called the Shoheiko, and this is actually the top school in Japan. And I'll discuss why this matters in a second. But the best school in Japan is the academy run by this Neo-Confucian scholar. So as you can imagine, right, the pinnacle of political thought in Japan, the person who's in charge of that, is thinking about these Jushi concepts, these Neo-Confucian concepts. He's also trying to explain that, if you look carefully at Shinto's oldest writings, like the origin story of Japan is written as a Shinto text, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. We can see that Confucianism, especially the new Confucianism that he's trying to embrace of Jushi and Shinto, they actually sort of match up really well. And the concepts have different names, but they in fact can be part of the same thing, and they make sense together. He also was very worried about Christianity, Christianity's possible influence on Japan back in 1600, and he's part of the movement that is so strong, right, that eventually expels Christianity. In particular, Hayashi Razan emphasizes the 5 relationships. Again, right? Going back to these classic Neo-Confucian ideas. Can someone name one of the 5 relationships I just mentioned? Tell me your name again. Yes, give me one. Father to child, yeah. All right, how about a couple more? John, yeah. Husband and wife, how about one more? What's your name? Gabriel? Okay, so there's 5 of them. You guys have a few of them, but these are categories that everyone can understand, right? They're very simple, right? These are 5 simple everyday life relationships that Hayashi Razan would like people to use to structure their lives. In those relationships, people have giri, which refers to obligation, like what you're supposed to do, your moral duty. And as you'll see, moral duty sometimes can conflict with emotion or with the law, right? In his view, moral duty is always supposed to be to the law in the end. But anyway, moral duty, because of the ruler-subject relationship, takes precedent. But anyway, giri is one of these important ideas he's emphasizing. He also emphasizes propriety, which is, I think, a strange word. It doesn't just mean like how you dress or being proper. It means following rules, right? It means knowing the rules, following the rules, and that the best virtue is demonstrated by following the rules. I think you'll also see this particular quote from him embodied in the text you're going to read tomorrow on Friday. Back to our old pyramid here of how the society is structured. This is a Neo-Confucian structuring of society, that the peasants, the emperor is on top because he is the ruler of Japan, and the shogun, who has the real power, is in theory below the emperor. But what's most important are the other classes, the samurai or the warrior class, peasant class, and artisans below them, and the merchants. So the merchants don't produce anything. They just make money. They don't have a real role besides that in society, so they should be at the bottom of society. Peasants, artisans are a bit better because they actually transform things into products. And peasants, who are the ones who actually, with their hands in the soil, produce things out of nothing, they're the ones who should be the most venerated among the commoner classes, or so this ideology contends. The warrior class, as the elite, they're above the samurai, above the peasants and the artisans and the merchants, and they should be the ones sort of leading society with knowledge, with virtue, etc. And above them are the ruling elites. So you get that there are different classes here, different parts of society. This is a quote from Hayashi Razan. Read this just real briefly here, and I want to ask you a question about it afterwards. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. How does this play out in real life? You know, like Earth is, low, heaven is high. Okay, yeah, I get that. How does this relate to real life? If you are a student of Hayashi Razan and you're practicing this ideology, how do you turn this into something more practical? Yeah, and tell me your name again. Peter. Yeah. Yeah, so peasants don't question the rulers, right? Don't even question the samurai class, right? Because they're above you. So the simple idea here is that people can stay in their place, right? If you're a commoner, you can't marry into the samurai class. If you're a merchant, you shouldn't marry into the peasant class either. But you shouldn't try and leave your station in society. And this is probably the most important takeaway, I would say, for Hayashi Razan's form of Neo-Confucianism is that he wants people to stay in their place. And this is how Japan as a country will function best. If everyone stays in their place. This ideology is at the very top, but it doesn't just stay there. Before the Edo period, before the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu, there is education happening, especially among people who can afford to pay a Zen Buddhist monk to come and train them, because they have such great training in Chinese literature, history, and religion. There are also members of the court who sometimes can be asked to come and train you if you would like as well. So there's a financial component. You can get education, but you can pay for it. What changes in the Edo period is that we have an early modern system of education that's available to most people in Japan. This is I think, a really big and important deal. So we discussed the school of Hayashi Nazan in the capital, the Shoheiko. If you are a samurai and you are really smart, you can aspire to go to Shoheiko. To get to the Shoheiko, you have to first go to the domain school, which is the local domain, or a han is the local sort of like the level of the state, at a small state. And there are about 250 domains at this point of time in Japan. So each domain also has a school which the shogunate helps to fund. Samurai who are trained at the Shoheiko will go teach at the domain school, and that's one way the ideology is spread to the samurai class, right? But then there's also at the lower level of the village, there also is the temple school, or the terakoya. And this is an informal institution, but which is also helped by the state financially, where people can go, and a monk or a priest, sometimes a poor samurai, will teach for very cheap the children out of the village. So most kids, they have to work in the field, right? And they get to terakoya maybe twice a week. Other kids go more often. But this system of schools is actually quite effective. This is an image of boys in terakoya. As you can see, they don't always do what they're supposed to do. Sometimes these two here are crying because they're being punished. And there were also sometimes mixed classrooms, or sometimes there were also girls terakoya. This is a little bit later drawing of a young girls terakoya, where the girls are also doing things that are not necessarily very educational. She's got her tongue out over here. But despite all of these sort of shenanigans, the students were learning a lot about how to write in Japanese. Antonio.
What were the three schools after?
So the Shoheiko, the domain school, the Hanko, and then Terakoya are the village schools, right? The temple schools, because they were held usually in temples. That's why they're called Terakoya. Yulia.
Yeah, I was just wondering, there are a lot of words that are like in Japanese. I was wondering if you have to know all of them.
Good question. So I guess the answer is no. Before the exam, you'll each have your review sheet that has all the terms that will be on the exam. There'll be a few more than on the exam that you'll choose from. I think 25 on the exam, and I'm going to give you 30. But you'll have the terms you need to study for, so you can focus on those terms as you study. And I would suggest that you work on just those terms and not go above and beyond that. Good question, which I've actually had before, I think, from, is it Joe? Yeah. So the information that these students are getting, right, it's a combination of writing and some literature, as well as some religion, but it's also a lot about how to behave, how to be proper, right? Proper, not proper, but proper, how to fit in society and in their proper roles. So this is one way in which ideology does spread, as well as literacy. So the Japanese, by 1800, are the most literate society in Japan, most likely. We're not, it's hard to compare. We don't have a lot of peasant information from most countries at the time, but when Westerners come to Japan, 1850s, they're shocked at how well, even the commoners, right, in Japan are able to read things in Japanese and to write. We also have a burgeoning sort of print media culture that takes shape in the Edo period. People can read, right? So we have novels that that take off. We have local gazetteers and newspapers. Families began to compile their own encyclopedias to sort of explain who is who in the family and when they were born, where they were born, etc., who married whom. We have dictionaries that talk about urban life. So if you go to Edo, you know what to call the chamber pot, or you know what to call the taxi driver or whatever. And they're also reading manuals that are sort of on how to do things. So people are reading manuals about how to farm. They're reading manuals about how to make geita, like wooden shoes. They're reading manuals about all kinds of things to help them do this better. So this is all part of the print culture. There are even sex manuals. Thank God for that, right? So all these things are really making the culture very literate and also very educated, I would say, even. So let's talk about Eiken. So one of the big shifts is among authors is how do you appeal to this broader audience now that can read? One figure who masters this very well is Kaibara Eiken, who was a scholar, a Neo-Confucian scholar. So he wants to keep doing that. He wanted to vulgarize Confucian thought. He wanted to make it more accessible. So he wrote books, first of all, in the vernacular. So he wrote using a lot of hiragana that everyone could read, even women who were not getting enough education necessarily, or children. He used simple stories and simple texts that conveyed sometimes complex Neo-Confucian thought in layman's terms. He wrote several books, but one book that he wrote that has sort of an enduring impact is Onna Daigaku, The Great Learning for Women. And I want to take a second right now actually and read this text. So I think I'm going to have somebody read this. I need a volunteer who can see the board and who can read this text. All right, and tell me your name again. Elizabeth, can you read for us, please? All right. And we can just keep, I'm not going to have you read anymore, but thank you for that. That was great. A lot of hard words, a lot of strange words, and also for me a spelling mistake. And you got through that beautifully. Thank you very much. If you keep reading, this is more of the same text, like Haibara Eiken. Okay, so if you were a woman and you read this, how do you feel about this text? Is it pretty clear, first of all? I think it's pretty clear, right? Like, okay, these are rules for my life. All right. How might you find this text frustrating if you're a woman? Yulia? Yeah, so I think that these are stifling rules. Right? These are rules about how one can be quiet, how one can be submissive, how they can be part of society by not being too obvious. Yeah, and I've forgotten it, Ross?
Yeah, my name's Ross.
Yeah.
I was just interested, it seems like they're saying only focus on the husband. You don't think of like anyone in the higher realm, like you'd rather be further.
Oh yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like even if your husband is rebelling
So very good point. So one key idea here is that women belong to the private realm, right, and men are part of the public realm. This is one of the important Neo-Confucian ideas, right, is that there's a separation between the two. And so in theory, the woman should only follow her husband. And the texts written for people about following the state don't apply to women. We can't get into this too much detail, but in the late, like when the Edo period is coming to an end and a new government is taking over Japan, there are women whose husbands are going against the shogunate and who take part in that because they think it's a good cause. And there are some who go against their own husbands to help this other cause. So there is some sort of ideological dissonance happening, right, between these two, and you're right to point that out. Lauren? Hmm. Yeah. So exactly. So all these pieces make the woman's world. It confines the woman's world to the home, right? She is there for reproduction. She is there for household chores and tasks. She can keep money. She's there for being polite. She's there for service as well when there are guests. These kinds of things. Antonio?
That was also interesting how it says that she has to treat her mother and father-in-law above her own family. And since she has to her will has to be like her husband, her family is
Yeah, and actually, this is a big change in ancient Japan up until until the sort of overarching dominance of Confucian thought. Homes were matrilineal, so men went to live with the wife in her household, right? So this was all very different. But Confucianism really changed that, so that by the Edo period, actually before that, even by 1300 or so, this has become patrilocal, patrilineal. The woman goes to the male household, has to respect his parents above her own, etc. So all these things, you're right to point them out. We have to keep going because we don't have a lot of time, but I think that you're seeing that this text has a lot to unpack. What I will also say, though, is to be fair, is that this is a text that was written to tell them how to behave. Not everyone in Japan followed this. And also this was really followed mostly by the elite class and those aspiring to be like the elite class. So, Japan was more diverse than this might perhaps give the impression of, but it was the ideology that was being propagated. There are also books on how to get from A to B. I'm going to skip over the next two names because I don't have a lot of time, and I'll just say that there were ideologies that were a bit different than Hayashi Razan's ideology that coexisted, right, and that sometimes challenged them a little bit. But they were still part of the overarching orthodoxy. I want to mention one person last, and we'll see if I have time for anything else. There was one kind of what I call a sort of an alternate orthodoxy that was that took shape in the late Edo period, which had the seeds for a very different worldview, and I want to discuss that briefly. So the Tokugawa shogunate is hereditary, obviously. But there is a cadet branch, like a junior branch of the family, that if there were no children or direct relatives of the shogun, could be asked to become shogun. And this family, their domain was called Mito. It's a very big domain or Han over here. They also had the last name, as the slide shows, Tokugawa. They had a lot of money, a lot of free time. They couldn't govern because they were part of the family, unless they were asked to be shogun, which never actually happened until 1867. So with that time and money, they worked a lot on learning. They brought the best scholars in Japan to Mito. They began to write a history of Japan, going back to its sort of mythical origins, and that was finished finally in the modern period even. They also began to play with an idea of trying to rationalize Japan's government. And it didn't make sense that the emperor was powerless if we have the triangle, right? The emperor has no power. He gets like a government. He gets like an allowance, right, from the shogunate. It doesn't make much sense. And they tried to sort of grapple with this academically. And this is one of the seeds for dissent and rebellion later on. So I want to plant the seed here today. We'll discuss it more in next class. The other ideology in question that's also a bit, I think, dangerous, controversial, and which eventually sort of merges with the Mito-gaku, the Mito school we just talked about, is that of Motoori Norinaga, who also originally a Confucian scholar. He's also a physician. He was not of the samurai class. He was of the merchant class. But anyway, he got education, became interested in the history of Japan, its original ancient history. And he eventually started the movement in his own school that advocates kokugaku, or national studies. So what is Japan? Where does Japan come from? And this has been going on for some time, right? People have been having this question for maybe about a century and a half, partially because the original texts of Japan's history, written in 712 and 720 in the Common Era, in a weird Chinese hybrid language, have been copied thanks to Western printing presses, and they're available more often now. So people can get these documents and they can read them and try and understand them. So Motoori Norinaga has a copy of this text called the Kojiki, which talks about Japan's origins from the first gods, Izanami, whose union creates the sun goddess and also eventually creates Japan, all the way through the first emperors, up to 712, emperors and empresses, up to 712. He reads this text, and he thinks he's understood two important things. First, he gets that this text is in Chinese, but he thinks you can also read it and try and peel away the Chinese part and see what's really there, like the original language of Japan. In theory, this text was actually spoken before it was written down, and he's trying to recover that spoken ancient Japanese language. In doing so, he claims that, first of all, it's literal, right, that these different gods and goddesses, all this, it really happened, right, and that Japan's emperor is indeed the sun goddess's descendant, which is part of the Kojiki story. The first emperor of Japan was, in fact, a god, and this is a very literal interpretation of the Kojiki. He also thinks that the emperor's role is to stand between heaven and earth as a mediator, right? And so it's a pretty important job. This idea is actually a very Chinese idea, in fact, but in this case it's a bit different because the emperor cannot be deposed. Right? There's only one emperor of Japan, only one sun goddess of Japan, only one line. And this is still the case today, right? There's still one imperial family in charge of Japan today, whereas in China, things happen. There could be someone who gets the heavenly mandate. In Japan, it comes from the sun goddess from Japan's origin that cannot be changed. So this idea is what he brings to the fore. He also thinks that Chinese ideas like Confucianism and Buddhism are just horsewash. There's too much China in Japan, and he would like to peel back all this cynicization and to reveal what the true Japan is. For him, the true Japan is actually was a simpler Japan. It was a beautiful place with a beautiful language, with very clear rules about society. They didn't need Confucian thought to organize society. We just needed to be Japanese. And there are these cultural traits which he identifies. One of these traits is pretty influential and I think pretty well known. It's called mono no aware. This phrase means to have an empathy for things, if we translate it. What it really means is Japanese people, in his view, are always attuned to nature. Like when it rains, they're a little bit sad. When they look at a sakura, a cherry blossom that only blooms for 2 weeks and then falls off the tree, they feel emotion about that, right? They feel empowered by rivers. All of these things are, for him, Japanese cultural traits that are only Japanese, and that all the other stuff is clouding Japan's identity. So, long story short, he would like to rebrand Japan and sort of pull Japan out of its Chinese funk and let it sort of shine again as a very independent, very distinct culture. And he uses this old text to define what that culture is. and he also wants the emperor to be in charge of all that. So we'll talk next class about how all this plays out, right? How this new constellation of power can be actualized. So thanks, guys, and have a good